Welcome to Ingenium On Demand.
Hello and welcome so much, and thanks for being here to our session on ethics and technology. This is an overview for engineers and technical professionals. And I just want to say that RGI, on behalf of RGI, we're just so happy to be a part of Ingenium again and to be working with the association. It really is good to be back, and we want to say, let's have another great year. So let's dive in. I want to ask you a question right now about the relationship between perhaps grocery shopping and ethics. What might that be? You're probably thinking, I'm not really sure. Let's talk about it. You walk into a grocery store, you do all your shopping, you come out, and suddenly you realize that you have a whole carton of soda on the bottom part of that shopping cart that you didn't pay for. So what choices do you make? What decisions and what actions do you take? Do you think, it's just a few dollars, I'm going to throw it in here? Or do you go back into the store and pay for it? This is one of those everyday ethical dilemmas that we come across, choices that we make and actions that we take. And that is the heart of ethics. And particularly today, we'll be looking at ethics and technology in the world that we're in as engineers and technologists. So why is it so important to us? I know you're thinking a lot of things in your mind right now, so let me suggest a few here. We want to increase our awareness to increase the value that we place on the decisions that we make and how we make them. And that's a big distinction we're going to talk about today. We also want to minimize our unethical behavior. And that's important too. It's not like any of us go around and say, I'm going to be unethical. It just helps us to understand how we arrive at our ethical decisions so that we can look at the world around us and maybe even help minimize those as well. It helps us to fulfill our requirements in our professions. Virtually every profession I know has a code of ethics. And so this will help us be able to move forward on our education in those areas. And we also want to define what we stand for. It really helps us do that. We can more clearly articulate how we arrived at our decisions for others who may question them. And finally, it helps us develop our reputation. When we can speak clearly and succinctly and directly about how we make our decision, it helps us with our reputation as ethical developers. So let's jump right in. We're going to be setting the foundations for ethics, and we're going to first begin by listing the building blocks of ethical decision making. That's an important basis. Then we'll look at the role that reasoning plays in how we make our ethical decision. This is the tool of truth, as we like to call it. We're going to describe a syllogism and its basic building blocks, because this will help us see how we develop or arrive at particular logical decisions. Then we're going to look at a couple of broad branches of ethical theory so that we can begin to understand not only how we arrive at a decision and have a perspective on it, but how others do as well. Then we're going to describe something called the categorical imperative, which is what I call the ethics litmus test for, is an action and its impact a good one? And then in the second half, we're going to introduce 6 specific ethical roles we face in our field. So let's get started. Here's our introduction to ethics. And we want to first ask that question, what does it mean to be ethical? Well, an 18th century philosopher, Immanuel Kant, who did a lot of work in this area, he said this quote, "In law, a man is guilty when he violates the rights of others. In ethics, he is guilty if he only thinks of doing so." Think about that as we go through the course. So what does it mean to be ethical? Well, it's determining what is right and what is wrong. That's the field or the study of ethics. Is it what we think or what we do? Is it an aggregate of those two things? Do ethics constitute beliefs on how to act or the act itself? These are some of the things we want to come to understand, because this is what makes up the field of ethics. And once we begin to understand these principles, we can talk more clearly and logically about how we make these ethical decisions. Remember, there's different types of decisions. There's business decisions, and there's ethical decisions. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So how do we define ethics? Let's take a look at it. It studies the concepts surrounding our human actions in terms of what we consider right or wrong. What's the improper or the proper thing to do? Is it a list of rules and regulations we must follow? In some circles, yes, and that's defined as normative ethics. In other words, we're defining specific norms by which people should follow. But that's not what we're talking about here today. We're really talking about the actions and the decision-making behind those actions and how we arrive at them. In other words, you're not going to walk away from this course with a list of do's and don'ts for your field. What you are going to walk away with is a much better understanding on how you make those decisions and how others make those decisions, so that we can work together to come up with the best decisions. Now, what about technology? Because this is a course called Ethics and Technology, and we're going to specifically focus on this. So one of the definitions is the application of science, especially as it's relating to industry or commerce. Another way a technologist put it, his name is Costello, is he said, it's technology that takes the elements that were scientifically being studied and moves them into mainstream consumer use. It's important for us to think about that this is what technology is. And the reason that definition is important is because these elements of science are now in the mainstream with people being applied. And with that comes some pretty serious ethical responsibilities. So let me start with a simple question here, and I want you to just think about this for a minute. You can even stop the recording and just take a moment to think about it. How many people here have taken a math class in grade school or high school? I hope you're all saying yes. How about some sort of language skills, perhaps English? Hopefully in grade school and high school, you took some sort of class that helped you be a speaker of a particular language. Now let me ask, how many people have taken an ethics class in grade school or high school? Every once in a while, one or two people, when I give this in the classroom, will raise their hand and say that they had some form of this, but it's not typically in our mainstream curricula. And yet, it very much is a field of study with rules and all kinds of information that's great to learn, just like math, just like English. Think about it. What would happen to your ability to cope in situations that are everyday, regular situations if you had never taken math? Could we balance a checkbook? Could we do a home improvement project? There's so many things that we rely every day on mathematics. And the same with our ability to cope with our language skills and communication. What would happen with our ability had we not taken some sort of formal study? So how about those difficult everyday moral, ethical situations that we face? We can actually practice and get better at our decision making around what's right or what's wrong, or what we call the ethical decisions. Think about it. Could we play hockey without understanding the game or how to skate? Could we design a bridge without understanding maybe science of soil conditions and all of the other fields of study and technology and science that goes into that? We might be able to do both of those things, but not very well, and not to an expertise level. So that's what we want to do with ethics. Ethics is a formal discipline of study. And today I want to introduce you to it before we ever start talking about those specific ethical situations that we as engineers, maybe there's some architects or technologists out there face. Why? Because we need a robust background to make great decisions. Ethics is a formal discipline with rules, methods, and tools, and it's really fun. So let's learn some of those principles and techniques, and then I'm going to give you a few little things to practice today, but then I want you to walk away from this and think about how you can actually practice the skill more. Just like if we want to learn to play the piano, what did our parents always tell us? Practice, practice, practice. If we're on that hockey team, practice, practice, practice. All right. So good ethical behavior can become a habit. Bad ethical behavior can become a habit. We want to develop those skills and the way that we arrive at our decisions so that we have habitually good decision-making practices. Now, here are some of the principles that we're going to talk about when it relates to ethic. We're going to talk about a little bit of the theory. We're going to look at that thing I talked about, sound reasoning. And again, we'll practice a little bit today. So, a famous Western philosopher first came up with this concept of how we must learn by doing. That was Aristotle, who is considered in the Western world one of the fathers of ethics. And he said, for things we have to learn, before we can do them, we learn by doing them. For example, men become builders by building, and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too, we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, and brave by doing brave acts. He is the first person in Western philosophy to start to say, hey, ethics is a skill, just like playing an instrument or building a ship. It's character building, and it's a skill. Now, jump ahead a couple thousand years, and we've got another person who basically said the same thing. Maybe some of you have heard of the business guru Stephen Covey, the habits of highly effective people. Same concept, different man, different era. And he said this because he took Aristotle and built on it in his 7 habits of highly effective people. Aristotle said we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. And Covey says our character basically is a composite of our habits. So we want to practice these really good ethical decision-making abilities. So let's look at some of these building blocks of ethics. How many of you do play an instrument that you might be considered an expert at or a professional level? Maybe a sport that you can be considered an expert or a professional. Well, humans are capable of reasoning as well. And this is the skill that forms the foundation of ethical reasoning. Like any skill, we're going to talk about it a little bit, we're going to learn its principles, and we're going to practice. Practice, practice. So, let's take a look. We're going to inject reason into how we make decisions so that we don't do something like fall into false reasoning. So many of my friends and colleagues hate when I sit there and I watch television with them, particularly when it's in a season of politics, because somebody will say something and I'll say, oh, that's a false reasoning. That's a fallacy. That doesn't make sense. Because they're not doing the if A equals B and B equals C, A must equal C. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at this. So ethics is based on well thought out actions, reasoning abilities. Our ability as humans to reason help us determine that right action, and logic is the skill that helps humans arrive at the right or correct course of action. And when we apply logic repeatedly and we practice it and we understand it, it becomes our habit and our character. All right. So there we are, the basic principles. Now let's take a look at how do we think ethically? By using right reasoning. That's what the ancients used to call it. I think that's neat, right reasoning. And what they really wanted to reinforce, and what we do in the field of ethics today as well, is that we say that ethical acts are not emotional acts. Now, we also say that if you become emotional about something, you need to stop and think, because that's kind of the red flag. But when you go to act, you must take a step back away from the emotions and come up with well-deliberated, reasonable choices and decisions. This is what the area of law was initially developed for. People came together and said, when people are at their most emotional state is when they're least likely to make a good decision. So let's put together a canon or a body of laws that will help direct them in those times. And that's when we even start to have that study of normative ethics. All right, so sound reasoning, let's take a look at it. It's well-deliberated, reasonable choices. It's not something we do in anger or being upset or being down. We really want to take a step back and make reasonable choices. So here's a visual of how this looks. Logic forms the foundation of our reasoning skills. Reasoning is the support for our decision-making ability, and at the very top of that are our ethical decisions. That's the flow of reasoning. So, moral character is far more than just stating an opinion. Ethical acts are not emotional acts. They're well-deliberated, reasonable choices, and a series of well-deliberated, reasonable choices starts to form our moral character. All right, so it's kind of like computer programming, though. Garbage in, garbage out. We want to make sure that we're reasonable, that we have good information flowing into the decision so that we get a good decision coming out. So what is this thing I'm talking about, logic? It's often called the tool of reasoning. It helps us think through problems and become more rational. And this is a good foundation to start for developing our moral character. There's a great little book on this called Being Logical. And in this, it says, being logical presupposes our having a sensitivity to language and the knack for its effective use. For logic and language are inseparable. We want to be clear. We want to be focused. We want to be complete. We want to think about the words that we use and how we approach language. Isn't that kind of an interesting tie? All right, so logic as the tool of truth. What does it do? It fine-tunes our reasoning ability. It removes the emotions, and with those emotions, the biases around making a decision. And it helps us to see true relationships. In fact, that's one of the basis of the word truth. True relationships, real ones. So how do we use it in language? Well, we use formal structures. And this is a tool that Aristotle developed to help us actually work on and practice our skills of reasoning, because he felt this was so important that we needed a way to be able to practice how we make reasonable decisions. So we came up with some particular structures that aid in clarity, objectivity, and fairness, just in the way we structure our language. And these he called arguments. Now, we don't want to confuse that with an argument. This is a structure of language used to show reasonable continuity. So let's take a look at these key elements right now. First, the key elements of logic. Number one, clear, unambiguous language to show relationships and ideas. No fuzzy stuff. Clear. Understanding the facts, all of them, even the ones that may not support what you're trying to prove, but all of them, and objectively presenting them. Understanding all of those facts around the situation and learning how to effectively communicate them. Look, these are the rules of the discipline of logic. In other words, we have rules on how to play hockey. We have rules on what we do to play the piano. These are the rules of logic. And Aristotle, in order to help us practice this, came up with a little thing called a syllogism, which is a very simple form of an argument. It's kind of like first learning to play the scales on the piano. Very simple language structure so that people could start to see how we can reason through and come up with a great decision. And these are called the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. Now, don't worry, we're not going to get way off on a logic class here. I just want to show you a couple of basic structures that form an argument so that you can start looking around and thinking about this in your everyday language and discussions with people, particularly about areas where you have to make some pretty important ethical decisions. So a premise begins an argument and it supports your main idea, or what you're trying to say is right or wrong. And the conclusion states your final position on it. So here's a major premise. Every A is B. There we go. Every A is B. Everything within the group of A is B. Every C is A. So everything within the group of C is A. So what must we absolutely logically must conclude from this language structure? Every C is B. So if every A is B and every C is A, every C is B. This is logic. Now, we've got some sentences with some letters, and you're thinking, great, wonderful. How does that help me? Well, that's theory, but that's not enough. We've got to be aware of what people are saying to us and how they are arriving at their conclusion. Does it make sense? Is it truth? Because logic shows us if there is or is not truth. And so we practice this. It takes the emotion out of our decision. And instead, it injects this well-deliberated, reasonable path. Now, where do people begin to disagree? With the premises, right? If you don't agree with premise 1 or premise 2, then you're not going to believe in the conclusion. But at least if we clearly state those premises and we can talk about them without emotion, we can begin to understand and agree to disagree without the emotional charge. That is another reason we want to inject ethics into our everyday habits. Now, we don't talk in syllogisms, right? So we need to be able to step back and just think if what people are saying has a logical, reasonable relationship. So here's one of those examples that I want you to practice on. I want to say this about my design specification. I fixed everything my manager listed at the design review, and because of that, the design is ready to go. Believe it or not, we can put this in a syllogism, right? There's an A equals B, B equals C, A equals C here. Take a moment, stop the recording, and see if you can actually put the conclusion first and then put the two premises that must make you arrive at this person's conclusion. Okay, so let's take a look at this together. Premise 1, I fixed everything in my design specification that my manager listed. Now, if you did that and we all agree to that, great. That's clear, concise, complete. Let's go to the next one. My manager knows what needs to be fixed in this design specification. There's the assumed second premise. Now, if you agree with this premise, then you're going to have to agree with the conclusion, but maybe you don't agree with this. And that can be where the start of the debate is. But if you agree with premise 1 and premise 2, then you must agree with this conclusion. Therefore, my design is ready to go. All right? So what I want to challenge you to do after this course is to go out there and start looking at how people arrive at their decisions on what they should do or shouldn't do, what's right or what's wrong, and see if you can think about the logic of it with taking out all those emotions. All right. So now we're going to look at a couple of those theories that I talked about that take certain areas of reasoning and how they go about it. And we're going to talk about something called deontological, categorical imperative, teleological, and utilitarian. These are kind of different forms. This would be like the difference between classical, jazz, ragtime, any kinds of different music. These are different ethical theories. So let's take a look at these. What is deontological ethics? Wow, that's a big word for a very simple concept. It's ethical theory that people figure out what's right or what's wrong based on if it's their duty. Right? Is this a dutiful thing to do? And the way I remember this is the D in deontological, D for duty. Right? Is it my duty to do this? It's a duty-based ethical theory. So, what might one of those decisions be? Think about it for a minute. What are some decisions that we make as humans based on it's our duty to do it? Oftentimes we hear of someone in the military doing a tour of duty, right? It's our duty as a parent to ensure that we have good stewardship for our children. It may be a duty for us to take care of elderly parents. What is it that we or you consider an ethical decision you make based on duty? Okay. How about the categorical imperative? Another ethical theory, specifically from our friend that we talked about earlier, Immanuel Kant, and he said he kind of used this as a duty-based theory, and he called it as kind of litmus test. And I think this is kind of an interesting way to look at it. It says, act only according to the maxim by which you can say that at the same time, if what you do becomes a universal law. Okay, what does he mean by that? Well, let's break down the whole idea of categorical and imperative. An imperative is some necessary action. It's imperative you do this. All right? So that's what he means by your action is suddenly, imagine it becoming the law. Everybody must do this. Okay? And categorical, it applies to everyone. So basically what he was saying is, okay, I've got those groceries, that soda on the bottom of my grocery cart, and I'm going to take them back in and pay for them. What if that were the universal law that anybody who did that had to take them back in and pay for it? Would things be better or worse? Okay? And that's what he said we could kind of use as a duty-based test to think about our action and what implication it would carry. And that's how he said that we can come up with what he called a moral categorical imperative. All right? So let's say, on a job site example, what if everyone refused to wear a hard hat? Right? Someone comes in and says, I'm not wearing a hard hat. Let's look at the categorical imperative. If everybody came onto the job site and said, I'm not wearing a hard hat, would things be better or worse? Now, there may be business decisions around that, but from an ethical perspective, would things be better or worse? Acceptable or unacceptable? That's what we mean by the categorical imperative. And that's a theory. Another theory, teleological. This is something based on the outcome. It focuses on the consequence of our action. The word telos actually has as its roots the end, right? So we're thinking about what happens, what's the consequence of my actions, right? What happens if I do or don't do that? So think of what might be a teleological decision. A decision you make based on the outcome. Maybe giving to charity. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. That could be duty-based too. Absolutely. You both arrive at the same decision from different perspectives, right? So we're looking at thought process and intent, coming up with money-saving ideas at work, maybe paying taxes, right? You look at the consequence if we don't. Again, this could be a duty-based as well. So what we're really trying to look at here is how people arrive at their ethical decisions. Is it deontological or duty-based? Is it teleological or consequence-based? There's the other one, serving one's country. Again, could be on duty, but you may make that decision based on duty or based on thinking about the consequences if you don't. All right. One teleological theory that a lot of people have heard of, and this is why I bring it up, just to bring it a little bit closer to home or something that we understand, is called utilitarianism. This is a specific form of teleological reasoning. And basically, this theory says that a utilitarian would urge a decision to be made what's good for the greatest number of people, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So many of us have heard of utilitarianism, and that's basically one form of a teleological approach to making a moral decision. It's calculating the consequences to the most people. It's balancing the greatest good over the least harm. And often we need to do this, and we think of a lot of situations that may be global or a large group of people or a large community. Often a utilitarian approach will be applied to that. So think about some of the things that you think would be, or that you've known to be, utilitarian-based decisions. All right? Great. So what are some of these roles for engineers, architects, technologists, all of us who are in the field specifically around areas where we're working with technology in particular fields? And I'm going to focus a lot on my examples with engineers and technologists. We're looking at some really basic but important roles that are ethical in nature. So for the second half, we're going to talk about stewards of information and security, promoters of good usability, guardians who report on technological misuse or danger, dutiful researchers, ethical developers, and educated practitioners. If you look at these 6 areas and you put them together, these become a foundation of primary areas in our fields where ethical decisions must form a basis. And the role that we play in that is so important. So let's take a look. Let's start with some everyday ethical situations before we dive specifically into those in our field. Think about some that you face every day. Here's a few I can put out there, and I know you can think of a lot more. Do I run this red light because it's 2 a.m. and there's no one around? And when I make that decision, do I make it from a duty perspective or a consequence-based perspective? We could make the same decision, 2 different approaches. We can make 2 very different decisions, different approaches. Do I go back into the grocery store and tell the checkout clerk he forgot to charge me for the case of soda at the bottom of my grocery cart? We've been talking about that one, an everyday ethical situation. And by the way, when you think about what you would do with these, can you form a syllogism? Can you put it in a logical structure and then determine exactly how you arrived at that decision? So if someone asks you, you can clearly, concisely, and completely explain your reasoning without any emotion? Okay, do I tell my friend that his or her spouse is having an affair? That's a tough one. Do I tell human resources that a coworker is sexually harassing an employee? Could be a situation that we face. Do I tell my manager that a coworker is taking a large amount of office supplies home? Depending on what I decide, how did I arrive at this decision? What was it consequence-based? Did I think about it reasonably? Did I apply logic? Did I take out the emotions? Right? We're starting to build those fundamental building blocks. Do I write off my cell phone as a business expense, even though I use it mostly for personal use? These are everyday things, but they are ethical decisions. Okay, so now put us in our fields of study. We're immersed in technology, and with that technology, as we said, comes some very serious ethical decisions, because remember our original definition: technology, elements of the scientific fields, the engineering fields, all of our fields coming into mainstream use, right? At one time, a bridge was a theory. Now we use them every day. We have ethical implications around how we maintain them, how we build them, everything around that. So let's take a look at some of these. Here's what I want you to think about, and we'll come back to this at the end after you've gone through this course. What will the results of your work be? Will they be ethically acceptable? Here's a key question. How will you know? And how will you make or arrive at those decisions? When we raise that level of awareness around the ethical part of our everyday decision making, it becomes more influential and more habitual. Look, we're all driven to make a lot of important business decisions every day. We want to make sure those business decisions are injected with ethical decision-making as well. For those of you who have known or studied Albert Einstein, not only the theory of relativity, but was certainly instrumental in forming the first atomic bomb. And this is one of his quotes around that. He said, "It has become appallingly obvious that our technology has exceeded our humanity." I want you to just take a moment to think about that and what he might have meant around where technology is and how it's being directly applied in the mainstream. And what happens if we do that without an ethical component to that application? Can our technology exceed our humanity? That's why it's important that we study ethics. So we are first stewards of the technology we create and that we use. So what does it mean to be a steward? Stewardship is what we call custodial responsibility. So who are we in our fields? We're stewards over the information, the ideas that we exchange, the information that we both use and create. And as good stewards, we have to not only take care of that and use it well, but there's another element that a lot of people don't think of with stewardship, which is continuous improvement. So not only must we make sure that it's good and secure, we must also look at ways to continuously improve upon that information, that concept, that thing we're building, that thing we're taking care of. All right, so stewards of information are both users of information and research and developers of it. And we must be keenly aware that we must have an ethical perspective and decision-making process, not only about the information that we use, but about the information that we develop and disseminate for others to use. This is one of our most important ethical roles in our field. So as users, we want to make sure that we take care of this, and I've put this in quotes, this property, this information that we're entrusted with, and we've got to understand the true nature of the information and the data. It's our ethical responsibility to make sure that we've done our due diligence. Remember to look at all perspectives, to make sure that we're looking at all the information that's important and pertinent so that we can make good designs and good decisions. All right, so think of all these things that we're stewards of information of. Here's just a few that I've put on the screen, but I want you to consciously think about all of the information and elements that you are an ethical steward of. There's project management elements, notes, reports, schematics, specifications, all kinds of things. You may even want to take a few minutes to list those things and think about, what is my ethical perspective on these? So, stewards of information. And again, besides securing it, we have to make sure that that information is not misused. Well, how can we do that? There's so many dimensions to so many different elements of the information and ideas that we have. So we've got to make sure that we look at ways to secure the information and make sure first. Again, let's go back to language. Are we being very clear and understandable about the information we're disseminating? Are we keeping it secure? Are we getting it into the right hands? And then how can we seek ways to improve the processes around the information that's entrusted to us? These are all questions that I'm throwing out there that I want you to think about from an ethical perspective. Okay, so here's a little learning assessment. Again, I'll put this out here, stop the video recording, take a moment, and really think through this problem and how you would work with it. As a steward of information, Ed is a mechanical engineer assigned to help develop a new piece for the XYZ company. After 6 months, the project is canceled and the product doesn't pass a major gate review. So Ed is really frustrated with that project cancellation, and he throws all of his drawings in the trash and deletes that folder. Is Ed a steward of that information? And if so, did he make the right decision? If you agree that he did, see if you can write out your arguments or your premises, and which leads to the conclusion that he did make the right decision. And if you don't think he made the right decision, see if you can write out your arguments and make a conclusion that is absolutely a necessary and logical conclusion as to why he shouldn't have. So here's the questions I want you to think of. Is Ed the steward of the information in the scenario? Why or why not? Do you believe that it has ethical implications? And can you even say if it was your thoughts on this are, and your conclusions on his right or wrongness are teleological or deontological? Stop the recording and really take a few minutes to work through this. Okay, promoters of good usability. Wow, this one goes even a little bit in a different angle to stewardship. It's kind of a form of stewardship, but it's really about, is what we're designing or developing, or is the information that we're disseminating, is it usable by the intended audience? Now, what does usability mean? It means that the technology or the information related to the technology is easy to learn and understand for the audience. This doesn't say, oh, everything has to be sort of made easy in the most simplistic forms. What this means is it's absolutely usable and digestible by my audience. Not by the way I want to write it or explain it, but a way in which my audience can use it. There's actually an ethical implication to that. Now, we are the strongest advocates of good usability in our design and in the way we gather and disseminate our information. Some ways that we do this and some roles we might be in: audience analysis, product support information, the drawings, the schematics, the information that we gather and send out, marketing information even. These should all be an intricate part of the information that an engineer or a technologist uses. It's part of their development process. As we do that and we ensure that the information that we have can be used by the people who need to use it and used easily and comprehensively, we also are going to go one step further into the next role, which is we are guardians who report on misuse or danger. That's a step up from just usability. That's people looking out for the unethical implications, the misuse or danger. Look, we know that technology is often flawed, and not because someone is trying to be nasty or do something wrong. We're under tight deadlines. We got a lot going on, right? But it happens. Stuff gets released, technology goes out there, it's often flawed. Think about scanning for groceries. How many times is something scanned through, it was the wrong price? Incorrect charges on credit cards or accounts. Results from diagnostic medical instruments, a false positive, right? These things are very real. So we have to be the guardians who, if we detect this, because we're often in the developmental phases, we report on this misuse or danger so that it can be avoided before it gets into that mainstream use. Maybe it's in the mainstream use and we cite it. Now we have to make sure that we raise that level of awareness. This is tough to do. We even have a very negative word used for people who do this. We call them whistleblowers, right? That's not very good language for people who are guardians reporting on misuse and danger. They should be applauded. All right, so if you discover some sort of flaw, the first thing we do, again, is we start using our abilities of logic and reason, and we use research to find out more about it. We don't want to get all emotional and start just making claims that we don't know are true. Truth is logic. Logic is the tool of truth. So the first thing we do as those guardians is we make sure that it truly is flawed. We use those reasoning skills to determine if there is a flaw, what is the true threat, right? Truth, the true threat. And we keep a vigilant eye on those things for which we are the stewards, the guardians, the people the things that are entrusted to us. All right, so it's good ethical guardians who report on misuse and danger. We need to differentiate between accidental or unintentional versus intentional unethical behavior. We need to be able to clearly articulate those distinctions. Again, language is so important. Now, you might be saying, well, what if I'm subjected to decisions within my field from a person outside the profession? This happens. We still are in these roles of stewards, usabilities, guardians, and we need to be able to clearly, thoughtfully, and logically explain what we believe is wrong so that we can help create the right, or at least give enough information so that people know there might be problems. All right, so we've covered those first three. Now let's move on to our next, which is a dutiful researcher. Wow. I want you to think about that for a minute. And this is often in many professional societies' code of ethics. How you go about your research, right? We call it dutiful in this class. It means valid, good, sound research techniques for the information you're using, for the things you're developing. We have an obligation to learn about these different things. One of the first areas that's great to research is ethics, which is what we're doing here today. This is actually a part of your research. You're being a dutiful research in the area of ethics. Why? Because what we said from the very beginning, we're all immersed in these technologies that bring forth some pretty tough ethical dilemmas. right? And we can start learning how to apply them in our developmental worlds. The other part is, in your world of development, making sure that you're a good researcher, that you're staying up in the field, that you're dutiful about it, and that you make sure you're looking at as much as you can and all sides of the research so that you have a well-formed approach and decision. All right, so we have to keep current in our field. And with the new technologies, data, and information. Yeah, it's hard, and we can't know it all. That's also where teamwork and collaboration comes in. I remember once hearing a lecture from the physicist Green, and somebody in the audience asked him, how does physics today differ from the times of Einstein? And he said without hesitation, oh, that's easy. We're all working on the same problems around the world, and we're connected, and we're sharing. That's what we need to do to keep current in our field. No, we don't have to know it all, but we have to know where to go to look for it. We have to recognize that there are other people who know more than we do in certain areas, and just keep current and be collaborative. Now, in that research, one of the other perspectives of the ethics of dutiful research is how we acquire the information, right? We've all heard of a lot of corporate espionage these days. That's not really an ethical way to obtain information. So it's not only that you are a good and dutiful researcher, but it's how we acquire that information that also has a very big ethical implication to it. So here's another one of our learning assessments, something that you can just think through, a little problem to see how you would apply this for one of the roles that we've just talked about. This is on the Guardian, who reports on technology misuse or danger. So here's the scenario I want to set up. Acme Automated Warehouse Systems develops a sophisticated automated storage and retrieval system for large warehouses. And while writing the maintenance procedure on one of the system's cranes, the technical writer discovers, after conducting a usability test on that documentation, that a maintenance person can actually override the automatic braking system on the crane. The technical writer passes this information on to one of the engineers on the crane development team. And the engineer verifies that this brake can in fact be overridden, but it would be difficult to do. What should the engineer and technical writer do from an ethical perspective? And again, I want you to think about it. And I want you to also say, hey, when I come up with my conclusion, could I cite my premises? And am I basing my conclusion on a consequence or teleological based perspective, or a duty based or deontological perspective? Take a few minutes and think about the decision you would make. All right, now let's look at our next role. Ethical developers. What does it mean to be an ethical developer, and how can that role be? Well, we're just going to look at that. That could be a whole course in and of itself. We're going to look at a very specific area of this that really does influence us in our world of technology. And I want to look at and ask you to be aware of these areas around development. Again, there are others as well, but specifically, we want to just think about and be aware of copyright, trademark, plagiarism, and trade secrets, because these are elements of development that really do carry strong ethical implications with them. Again, copyright, trademark, plagiarism, and trade secrets. So what does this all mean? The first three are specifically covered under the law. So I would say, make sure you either understand the law or know a good lawyer. But remember too, we can live our lives completely within the boundaries of law and still live an unethical life, right? That's what that first quote was about. So yes, they're covered under law, and that law is there to help guide us to do the right thing. but we also have to make sure that we even think beyond the boundaries of the law as to what is right and wrong. Now, the last one, trade secrets, isn't even covered by law. So this is where we really get some important ethical perspectives, or we need to have good ethical perspectives on how trade secrets are handled, both within our companies and within the field that we're in. All right, so as an ethical developer, here's the thing. With copyright law, we kind of know what it is. It is a criminal offense, by the way, but here's some of the assumptions we can't make. We can never assume that anything that's out there on the web is not copyright protected. And in fact, from an ethical perspective, we must go into it assuming that everything is, and that we need certain permissions unless otherwise stated. I used to have people come to me all the time in the companies that I worked with, and I was this is when I was in the training and development area, saying, hey, I just went through this great training. I got the stack of slides as part of it. Let's start using these internally. And I'm like, have you got permission? Is it copyrighted? Is it trademarked? Because if it isn't, we can't use it. I also had a lot of people bring stuff to me that had something that they saw on a website that they just cut and pasted. And I'm like, this may have been out there and you could screen capture it, but did you get permission to use it? Now, sometimes people get confused because when we were in college, we could do that. But that's only because we were in college, right? We were in an institution that has, by law, the right to be able to do that only for educational purposes. Once we move out into the mainstream world of business, we should assume that everything is copyright protected and we need permission. You'll notice that every single visual in this presentation I have purchased specifically from a site that sells all of these images, right? So they have been paid for and used legitimately and legally. Good business practice, but more importantly, imperative ethical practice. All right, we can't assume that stuff that we did on the previous job we can bring over and use. Is it covered under trademark, right? Maybe it's a trade secret and it's not covered under law, but is it ethical and right to bring it over there? Or from any other source? We really need to understand what's free to use, what isn't free to use, and if it isn't free to use, how we ethically go about getting permission and rights, even if it means paying for it, to use it. All right. So it's up to us to be proactive and understand trademarks, copyrights, and patents. It's up to us to be conscious about our company's trade secrets and their ownership, even though it may not be protected by law. And it's important for you, again, as a steward of information, to ensure that you're protecting your information and that of the companies in the proper ways. All right. Plagiarism, a specific form of unethical behavior. Now, here's the thing. Plagiarism is taking something that's not yours and using it without giving credit so that it looks like it's yours, right? This is unethical behavior. All right, now, we don't debate whether it's ethically wrong. That's rarely debated. What really happens is the debate comes around who really owns the original work. And again, this is something that we, as ethical developers, need to be aware of, the original ownership. So as an ethical developer, here's your next learning assessment, the scenario that you can use to practice. So again, take a moment after we go through this and work through this scenario and figure out what you would do. A contract engineer has just completed code on a GPS technology that was used in a government system. One company who helped develop the GPS software recruits the same contractor to write the code for the company's civilian product, which is very similar to the government product. Different company, different product, trying to do the same code, only not governmental, but civilian. How can the engineer avoid plagiarism? Can the engineer avoid plagiarism, right? Ooh, let's go back there. So what I want you to think about is to just stop the recording for a minute and say how, if and how the engineer can avoid plagiarism. I want you to think about developing a well-formed argument using logic. And then I want you to see if you can say in your mind, does this look like a duty-based conclusion or a consequence-based conclusion? Take a few minutes now. Okay. Next, we have an ethical role in something called educated practitioner. Okay? That's what today's all about, really. That's what our recording is all about. It's making sure that we're continuing education. And that's what continuing education is all about. It's making sure that we stay current, specifically in our fields of study. Why does that have an ethical implication? Think about that for a moment. This is another area where you'll see many societies and professional organizations that have a code of ethics, and part of the code of ethics actually says that people need continuing development or educational hours. Wow, an ethical implication in that. Yeah, we have that ethical implication because as we keep our skills up, we can make better, more well-informed, more conscientious, and more robust decisions by staying current in our field today. So that's a part of it, and that's a part of what all of this is about and why it's so important that we come together in particular associations like this to continue to develop and work these skills. And congratulations and kudos to all of you who take part in Ingenium, because that is actually part of the ethical makeup of moving forward as educated practitioners. So here's some keys to remember. As we look at concluding this course, I want you to think about some things that we've talked about. First, information and technology and the advances around them bring about a lot of diverse ideas, not only from the business perspective, not only from a creativity perspective, but also from an ethical perspective about what is right or what is wrong. Think about some of the decisions and the thoughts that have exploded around the technology and information on social media, right? Of course, there's not only business and creativity and all kinds of different perspectives, but there's definitely been a lot of debate on right and wrong. And that's true for our fields. We want to make sure that we are doing the best that we can to be ethical in our business dealings, not just bringing an engineering perspective, not just bringing a business perspective, not just bringing an innovation perspective, but also saying, along with all of those elements, what is our ethical perspective? What is our ethical obligation? What are the ethical implications or consequences or duties of this thing or these things that we're doing and developing? One of the ways that we can get even better at this is to recognize and understand that ethical decision-making is a skill, and that we need to practice and sharpen the specific tool of truth, our reasoning abilities as humans, by going through logic, so that when we are faced with an ethical dilemma in our world, we have good ethical knowledge and expertise and skill to quickly and easily make a good, sound, ethical decision that we can clearly explain and articulate to everyone. Yes, just like Aristotle said, just like Stephen Covey said, we can get better at this. We can do it more quickly, more efficiently, and with higher quality by learning the skills and then practice, practice, practice. Remember, sound reasoning and good decisions instills trust. And trust is one of the most important elements of our business world, of our working world, and of who we are as professionals. Trust, what does it do? It fosters great customer relationships. It fosters that collaboration among our colleagues and that helpful willingness. Most businesses have shareholders, and it creates a solid shareholder relationship. And lastly, for you, it gives you a great feeling about yourself when you know, and when people say to you, yeah, I get what you're saying, I understand it, and I trust you. That's the power of ethics. So let's remember and go back to Immanuel Kant, that 18th century philosopher focusing on ethics. In a law, a man is guilty when he violates the rights of others. In ethics, he is guilty if he only thinks of doing so. It is important how we think and reason through and arrive at our ethical decisions. A lot of people may understand that releasing a particular product is a bad thing to do because it's not ready. But a lot of people may make that decision based solely on business. Wow, if this gets out there and people find out, we're in trouble, right? Rather than thinking of what are the ethical implications of it. So remember, ethics extends beyond what the law permits, and it asks us to be reasonable and truthful in finding relationships that are real. It forces us to take out the emotion and truly think about what's right or what's wrong, where there are true relationships in that thought process. And we are immersed in technologies that bring about these dilemmas. So I want you to think about these implications and the role they play and the role you play, one of those six, in the technology world today. Because we're all going to continue to improve upon our technical skills and the skills within our discipline. So let's improve on our ethical skills as well. So I want to leave you with this. I said it at the beginning, and now we've spent an hour together, probably a little more if you're doing those exercises. And I want to have you answer these questions again and keep answering them as you continue to build your skills around ethics. What will the results of your work be? Will they be ethically acceptable? And here's the key question: how will you know? And how will you make these decisions? And by being able to answer this, you can then logically and reasonably explain those answers to friends, colleagues, managers, shareholders, everyone, including yourself. Thank you so much for being here and being a part of this course today. If you want to learn more or just stay connected with me, I urge you to go out and link in with me. I'm out in LinkedIn under Lori Marra, and we do have the Center for Technical and Engineering Leadership. You can become a part of our little group on LinkedIn and see some articles on all kinds of neat stuff, including some stuff on ethics. I'd love to link in with you if you ever have more questions or thoughts around this or any other topic. So thanks so much. Congratulations. Good luck on Ingenium, and take care.
Thank you for watching. Visit the Ingenium On Demand library for more exclusive content.